My voice sometimes freezes up, apparently.
You might want to mute everyone.
Hector, go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome, all of you guys joining us for today's webinar on Venezuela, Witnessing Democracy in Venezuela, Resistant Empire. We would like to thank MAPA for hosting and also for providing technical assistance through Zoom. Yoav, thank you for organizing this, as well as folks from the Latin America Solidarity Coalition. A special thanks to Margaret Flowers, Adrian Pine, and David Paul, the embassy protectors who have agreed to join us today and share with us their experience. They were in Venezuela for the December 6th parliamentary elections, and we're looking forward to hearing from them and their report back, what they saw, their results, and what they, what they saw and what they can share with us today. So we're excited to have them with us here today. I'm gonna be talking just briefly about what's been happening in Venezuela over the past several years. It is hard to believe that it's been 2 years since the Trump administration decided to choose a new president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido. That was 2 years ago, the 23rd January of 2019. It has been something that has captivated many people. What's been happening in Venezuela. The Guaido experience has been a failure for the opposition in many respects. But the ones that have paid the price in Venezuela have been the Venezuelan people for the past, ever since the sanctions regime started. I would say that back in 2015, when former President of the United States, Barack Obama, declared Venezuela an unusual threat to the safety and security of the United States, that opened the door for what came next under the Trump years. The Trump administration was able to allocate funds and to intensify the hybrid war against Venezuela. It is a hybrid war. People are dying. The latest numbers, we don't know the exact number of deaths, but it's at least 100,000 people that have perished in Venezuela as a direct consequence of the sanctions illegally imposed by the United States on the Venezuelan people. It's collective punishment. It's illegal under international law, and that's what's been taking place in Venezuela over the past several years. I wanted to just, as far as a lot has taken place over the past few years. In Venezuela, we have an opposition that is divided. We have Juan Guaido, who's still recognized, unfortunately, by the Biden administration. They're not willing to talk to the Maduro government. So they're extending Guaido's lifeline. The European Union has decided not to recognize Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. So he's losing a lot of even more support nowadays. But nonetheless, the country that matters as far as recognizing Guaido is, as far as how legitimate he is the United States. And that's because recognizing Guaido keeps Guaido in play, and also gives Guaido access and control to Venezuela's funds that have been seized in the United States. We're talking in the billions of dollars. So in that respect, has created a whole different scenario. Venezuela is having a hard time surviving this brutal regime sanctions. It is draconian. It is medieval. It's brutal. The Venezuelan government has having a really hard time importing foods, medicines, and you name it, raw materials. Right now, there's a huge shortage of gasoline, so it's affecting every aspect of the Venezuelan day of life. Diesel fuel was added to the list of sanctions by the Trump administration back in, I believe it was November. So it has had a horrible effect as far as like transportation and farming. So people are dying by the thousands in Venezuela, and it's a direct consequence. It's a direct consequence. The hybrid war is intended to do just that. Speaking from personal experience, I lost my father 3 years ago because he couldn't have access to proper medications, and developed he developed a stroke as a consequence of not having enough anticoagulants readily available. I lost an uncle last year to malaria, complications from malaria, because the medicine that he needed to survive was not available. And now Venezuelans are among, fighting this hybrid war is become something that Venezuelans do every day. I mean, they are making strides around community organizing. The comunas, the communes are organizing and trying to lessen the blow of the sanctions. But even so, it's an uphill battle. Let's see. I wanted to, I mean, as far as what's going on right now, the new parliamentary elections took place in December 6th. So most of the elected officials are now members of the Maduro's political party, which is great. There was a low turnout, about 30% for Venezuela. Is a low turnout, and many of the positions decided to boycott the elections. I wanted to get started with our panelists, and I believe David Paul will be the first one to go and give us a report back on the December 6th elections.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? All right.
Yes.
Yes. Well, first I wanted to say that, I mean, the three of us are part of a larger collective that was defending the embassy. And the person who's missing is Kevin, who was such an important part of the struggle to defend the embassy, and just a real champion of solidarity with Venezuela. His courage, his optimism, his emphasizing unity was such an example for all of us, and his spirit really stays with us in all that we're doing, and I miss him a lot. I mean, one reason I became involved and interested in all this, and why Venezuela is so important, because Venezuela really is the focus of the struggle between imperialism and the poor and working people of the Americas, and of the world, really, in a way. And the success of the Venezuelan Bolivarian revolution is really important to continue that fight against the efforts of imperialism. And it just always puzzles me a little bit, and frustrates me how people can be so buy into the myth that we're around the world, we're promoting democracy and human rights. And I know I've said this quote before, but I like it. When 200 years ago, Simón Bolívar said, "The United States is destined to plague Latin America with misery in the name of liberty." And that's exactly what we're seeing here. And the hypocrisy, it's so stark when you look at the media stories about what's happening in Venezuela, and they look at the shortages. They give no context to the shortages, why they're happening. They rarely mention the sanctions. They only talk to the right-wing representatives, And some of the biggest lies were around this in this election, that there were in almost every mainstream report that there was the elections were widely thought to be fraudulent, and there was no opposition participating. Both were lies. They give no proof. And this, but you do see the effects of in the news and on the ground there, that the effort to kill the model of a socialist political revolution. They delegitimize the leader, Maduro, in all kind of ways. They destabilize the economy. And I think it's important to really listen to the imperialist own words. And this is my last quote, where Elliot Abrams, when talking to Congress, he said we champion democracy in the world, and we have proven that socialism does not work, is a failure wherever they try it. But we can't let Venezuela be an exception to that. And that's exactly what they're trying to do. And I think Hector mentioned a number of things about with the effects of the sanctions, and not just on importing goods, but the what goes along with it, which the sabotage, the attacks, the threats of military invasion, the theft of assets around the world, preventing it from trade. And we saw, and I spoke with a couple of families and a number of people around one of the biggest things, besides the gas, you see all these long gas lines, was the medicines, the lack of medicines for dialysis, cancer treatments, AIDS treatment, vaccines. And that's one of the most cruel ways that these sanctions are taking effect. The election interference is just incredible. How we talk about how can the US have any right to criticize the elections in other countries? And like the right wing, the United States uses lies and violence to attack the sovereignty of Venezuela. And there was an attack on the thousands of the election voting machines not too long before the election. All they had planned for providing new election machines. This constant refrain that the elections are a fraud. And while in this country, it's so hypocritical and ironic, the accusations by our current recent administration saying how our elections were fraud, and the other side demanding proof. But when they talk about fraud in Venezuela, they never demand proof. They just repeat the refrain that it's a fraud. And also the right for us to talk about their electoral system, which former President Carter and hundreds of international observers have said is one of the best in the world. The right that we have to criticize them when we have a system where it's possible that the person who gets less votes wins, and some votes are worth more than others. This election was such an example of the Venezuelan people speaking up for their right to have an election, to have a voice, an example of determination and their resilience, and a sense of dignity. The couple of families I spoke to really were puzzled how the American government thinks they have a right to tell us what to do, whether it's elections or anything else. And in the election system, I think maybe the others can go into more details, but they have it's incredibly transparent. They have frequent audits of the software, the machines, in 3 different stages of the voting during the election, with observers from all the political parties, international observers. These are even broadcast on television. But what was amazing was, despite all the sanctions and the boycott, the calls for boycott, the lack of shortages of gas, which affects people getting to the polls, people just being busy trying to maintain a decent life with all the shortages, and some frustration too. A lot of people talked about with the political process. Many people didn't have much faith that things were going to change. Even with all that and all the media propaganda, 6 million people went out to vote, and most of them voted and showed their trust in the government. And we had a really important meeting, which the others may talk more about as well, with the major moderate opposition, 5 major parties, 2 of them which used to rule Venezuela for decades before Chavez. And they emphasized to us, and this was the main message that I took from this trip, or at least to convey to people in the United States, that they want to join the political process of elections. They are against the sanctions, and stated very clearly that the elections were fair, transparent, and that were not fraudulent. And I mean, there's lots of challenges to facing the government. We heard from Maduro and other people in the government stating how that it's really important for them to address bureaucracy, corruption, deal with the problem of wages, and increase the public services, which have been so attacked by the sanctions. And I think that I just came back with the feeling that it's really important for us to make visible to people here the effects of the sanctions, to convey the voices of Venezuelans, what they're saying and what they're feeling, how the sanctions are affecting their daily life, and really talk to the other progressive and left groups here, and which are very divided and many very misinformed, but also go beyond that to reach other groups, and whether it's church, climate, labor, anti-racist groups, immigration groups. I just felt in general, my feeling was I was very impressed with how under all these horrible conditions and shortages, they could pull off this election very smooth, without any violence. And through thousands and thousands of voting stations through the country. And there was no, from the opposition and anyone else saying that it was fraudulent, only the government and the far right who boycotted it. And it was just really a statement of them standing up for their rights, their dignity. And I heard this from so many individuals. And I think I'll just stop there and let other people share what they experienced.
Thank you, David. Great. Let's move on to Adrienne Pine.
Well, thanks, Hector, and really, I think David gave a great background and covered a lot of the points that I'm also interested in talking about. So mostly, I will be, if anything, just complimenting what he mentioned. I think in terms of the issue of the ceaseless narrative from the United States that this is going to be fraud, it's going to be fraud, it's going to be fraud. We've seen this before with regard to Venezuela. I mean, really, the U.S. has been trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government since at least the, what was it, 2001, 2002 coup against Chavez, which of course Elliot Abrams led as well from his position in the State Department, and it continues to play that role. And most recently, or prior to this, the parliamentary elections in 2015, I remember I live in Washington, D.C., and I remember just sort of the lead up to the 2015 parliamentary elections, where there was just this ceaseless barrage of panels and announcements and articles from think tanks and universities, including my own American University, which were just basically working for the State Department to create this narrative that fraud was undoubtedly going to occur in these elections. And of course, what happened? The right wing won, the opposition won, and as soon as that happened, it all stopped. You know, they were like, oh, it was legitimate. You know, there was no more mention of it. But that's all they've got is this fiction. And of course, as David mentioned, in this context of, you know, what's going on in the United States with the accusations of electoral fraud and the you know, the lack of democracy we have here, but I think even more importantly, this sort of obsession that the Democratic Party has had with Russia interfering in US elections. When I mean, this has been the big joke in Latin America. When we started talking about Russia here, all of Latin America just burst out laughing because there has been no election in Latin America that the United States has not interfered in, basically, in the past 100 years. And that goes for much of the rest of the world as well. This time around, one of the things that that I noticed when I was down there observing, I was, you know, every so often when we were back at the hotel, I would go on Twitter and I was watching what the U.S. Embassy of Venezuela was posting. And of course, this is a sort of phantom Twitter account because they're really operating out of Colombia and there is no US embassy in Venezuela because they shut it down. And unlike in the United States, where the State Department violated the Vienna Convention, came in, violated the national property of Venezuela and arrested us for protecting the embassy against their coup, in Venezuela, the Venezuelan government has been taking great care to ensure that nobody enters the United States embassy and has really protected it. But that said, because the United, you know, obviously because they kicked out the Venezuelan diplomats, the United States is not in that embassy. And so they're running this phantom embassy out of Venezuela. And so they were tweeting these tweets, and I'll just read one of them. I'll translate it into English. This was the day before the election. It said, tomorrow in Venezuela, there won't be elections, and instead there will be a fraud that is carried out by the illegitimate regime of Maduro. The world is watching, and the Venezuelans are organizing to report it. Are you ready to defend democracy? And then there's like a hashtag, I won't vote, on 6D, which is the 6th of December. And so, I mean, here you have the US blatantly interfering and trying to prevent Venezuelans from voting, and already claiming that a fraud has occurred before the election has even happened, when, as David mentioned, the Venezuelan elections, in fact, are some of the most transparent in the world, as Jimmy Carter himself has mentioned, and as we witnessed in the election, and as the opposition that participates and the majority of the opposition also fully agrees with, that these are transparent elections. Their arguments are at other points, but not with the elections themselves. And so what was interesting is that the US Embassy actually subsequently deleted that tweet, presumably, you know, because it was so you know, so just blatantly a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty when they're trying to pretend that they are respecting democratic processes, although it's really a farce, with the US being virtually the only country now that is still recognizing this person that nobody in Venezuela takes seriously, Juan Guaido. So I, you know, I think that narrative of fraud is all the US has, and it's very much, you know, that we think of this as like a Trump tactic, but it's Trump, you know, I actually think that we're in a more dangerous position right now for Venezuela, because people, especially on the center left and left, whatever those sort of broad generalizations mean, want to peg everything on Trump, when in fact Biden has the same foreign policy. And we've seen that in his recognition of Guaido, and sort of the same, using the same language and the same kind of interventionist policies in support of the violent sanctions. But people, think that things are better now. So one of the other things that I really wanted to focus in on that was so striking coming from the United States, and I had been in Western Massachusetts. I had been in Amherst for most of last year, and then I went as soon as our probation was over on December 3rd. We all flew down immediately to Venezuela, because the elections were on the 6th. I was unable to get a COVID test in Western Massachusetts. As somebody who is from out of state, it was going to cost me between $300 and $500, and I couldn't even find a place where I could get a COVID test. And I was supposed to get a test in order to go to Venezuela, and I was all worried that I wasn't going to be able to make it because the Venezuelans are very serious about those precautions. But I was allowed. I got an exception from the body that we were working with, and I got there. On arrival, right at the airport, they had testing. There was physical distancing that was actually being enforced. People were not only wearing masks, but the airport workers were wearing full-on spacesuits to protect themselves. I mean, the PPE was a completely different level, and this was having, spent the day in various US airports, which were frankly terrifying. I don't know how many of you have flown, but people were not wearing masks. They were in regular, when they were in restaurants, at least they had their masks off. They were just as crowded as usual. And this was, in early December, and the outbreak was, well, as it is now, terrible. And I was terrified in the US airports. When I got in the Venezuelan airport, I felt so safe. And that feeling of safety continued. And it's bolstered by the numbers themselves. In the United States, I just looked at the New York Times global COVID map, which probably isn't the best source, but the US rate of can't remember, of infection, I think, is 32 per 100,000 right now, whereas Venezuela's is 1.6 per 100,000. So it's Venezuela is one of the safest places in the world to be right now, in terms of COVID. So even though, as Hector mentioned, the supply issue, thanks to the blockade against Venezuela, is having tragic and lethal results in terms of how it is impacting Venezuelans' health. The fact of the existence of a public health system and a government that deeply, and society that deeply prioritizes public health, even with the tremendously limited resources that it has saved countless Venezuelan lives. And one of the things that we found when we were there is from speaking to various people in and outside of the government, is that tens of thousands of Venezuelans who had left Venezuela because of the crisis induced by the United States sanctions have returned, because Venezuela is so much safer than the other countries, mostly in neighboring countries in South America where they had gone, and also because of the tremendous violence that they had experienced as Venezuelans in those other countries. And so many people have returned to Venezuela precisely because of that prioritization of protecting the collective and of healthcare. We saw that very directly in the polling stations as well. That was one of the things that most impacted me as an observer, was how deeply integrated public health was into every single step of the planning process for voting on December 6th. There were, there was sanitary, there were the whatever you call it, the wipe stuff, the liquid the alcohol. We were getting sprayed at, every other step. And it wasn't just us. I mean, there were people who were there and they were really sanitizing all the Venezuelans who came in. They were spraying their hands. Every step of the process was not only ensuring complete transparency and a complete prevention of any sort of fraud. And in fact, using technologies that I am sort of wary of in the United States, like using fingerprint technologies and identification technology and the ID cards. And there were all of these sort of triple safe checks that they would have to ensure that the person voting was exactly the person who was on the voter rolls. So there really was no way for fraud to be carried out at the polling booth, but also public health was just so deeply ingrained in every part of that. I felt safer in Venezuela than I have felt since the start of the pandemic anywhere. And it was scary coming back, and I miss that sense of freedom that I had there. And I guess yeah, I mean, I know that Margaret has lots of fantastic things to say, so I will leave it there.
Thank you, Adrian. That was very wonderful. Great great report. Margaret, let's move on to Margaret.
Great, thank you so much. So David, thank you for mentioning Kevin Zeese, my partner, who died in September unexpectedly. So Kevin was down in Venezuela in May of 2018 for the presidential election as a media person covering that. And when he came back, I was unable to go because I had a family commitment. He was just so impressed by the electoral system down there, and also the fact that what we hear in the United States in terms of the media reporting on Venezuela is usually the direct opposite of the reality down there. So being down there and being able to see what was actually going on was really critical for him to understand how massive the lies in the United States are. And it's the same thing. The 2018 election was said to be illegitimate, but the US called it illegitimate before it even happened. and Maduro definitely won that election and is the president of Venezuela, despite what the US is saying. I think Adrian really talked about the COVID-19 protections that we experienced, and I was so impressed by it and appalled when we flew into Miami that I actually wrote an article about it in Truth Out. So if you want to get more kind of details of the differences between what was happening in the US and Venezuela, you can check out that article in Truth Out. But I want to talk a little bit about the elections themselves. Because we hear how Maduro is a dictator and all this lies in the United States. There were 107 political parties that participated in this election, and more than 95 of them were opposition parties. Venezuela is so much of a deep democracy, so much deeper than here. They have 5 branches of government, and one of those branches is the National Electoral Council, or CNE. And actually, Kevin and I were in Venezuela on a peace delegation in March of 2019, and we met with the then president of the CNE, Tipase Luceno, and just learning about, Kevin and I have been third-party activists for a long time, so just learning about how their system is, how parties are able to participate, whereas in the United States, there's so many barriers to participation. Down there, they have, expectations that parties will organize and do the work and be an actual party, but they don't put these barriers in place to prevent them from participating. So the election did have, I think, around a 32% turnout, and that is not very different for Venezuela or when you look around the world in terms of parliamentary elections. It's the same thing for us in the US in the midterm elections. But of course, in Venezuela, a big problem was the fuel shortage and people waiting 2 to 4 days to fill up their cars with gas, waiting in line to do that, as well as there was such a sense that the Maduro's party, the PSUV, was going to win that I think people didn't feel such an urgency as well. And then if you looked in the opposition areas, the wealthy areas, that's where there were the smaller turnouts. In the Chavista areas, the lines were pretty long, and there was a good turnout in those areas. The process, we were there as official international election observers invited by the National Electoral Council. And so the great thing about that is that we were able to get down there early. Our probation ended December 2nd, as Adrian said, and we were on a plane as soon as we could get on one. And they gave us trainings. So we learned about the whole process. We went to the warehouse where they stored the machines. We saw how they conducted the audits, how they packaged them up. Then they store them in a military base. They're all completely put together in these kits, and then they have wrap around them, and then they're stored based on which polling center they're going to go to until it's time to transport them to those polling centers. They have all these different safeguards. So the whole process, the whole chain is monitored and recorded and made sure that there's no tampering with them. The United States, in addition, as part of the hybrid war, has also been supporting kind of these paramilitaries in Colombia, and there have been a number of attacks on the infrastructure of Venezuela. And while we don't know if that was behind this, earlier in the year, last year, there was a fire set at the warehouse where the majority of the machines were stored. So this, under the situation of an economic blockade, Venezuela lost almost all of its voting machines, and so had to get the new machines. But one of the upsides of that is that they developed their own software, where I think before they had bought outside software. And so everything in the machine was, Venezuelan made and tested, and, very reliable. When on the day of the election, the kind of process that people went through is they went, to their assigned voting center, and Venezuela has over 14,000 voting centers. They have a population of about 32 million. And you would look and see which room you were supposed to go to. Outside, there were these big lists, and you look for your name. It tells you which room. A lot of these were in schools, so you would go to a classroom. And then they would let one person at a time to the classroom to vote. They would go to the first table and show their national ID, and every Venezuelan voting, well, I think when you become a teenager in Venezuela, you get your national ID, and it's not like an oppressive thing. It's used for lots of the different services that you can access. They come in with their national ID, they put it on a little stand so that the poll workers were protected. They didn't have to touch the IDs. The person would put on the stand, poll worker would look at the number, enter it into the machine, then the person would put their thumb on that machine, show that it matched up, that it was actually them, and then that activated the computer. They would walk around to a private area where the voting computer was. They were only voting for two things: their delegate and their political party. And then they would vote very quick. Everybody we talked to said, oh, these machines are so much better. They're so much faster. They're easier. It would then, as soon as you submit your vote, it spits out a paper receipt, which you can then look at and say, oh, this is correct. This is who I chose. Then they fold that up, put it into a box next to the machine, walk around to the final table where they have to sign their name and put a thumbprint with the ink next to their name, so that to show that they completed the process. As Adrian said, the people are allowed to be in there as observers. Representatives of their political parties can sit in the room and watch the whole thing and make sure that that everything's going as it's expected. And then at the end of the day, they do an automatic public audit of 52 to 54% of the machines at that precinct. And so this is public. People can attend and see it. They take the box, they take out the paper receipts, they hold them up, this vote for this, they count it, and then they match that with the report from the machine. If everything matches up, that precinct is good. They send the results on. If they have any discrepancies, they do a hand count of 100% of the machines. So, this is, we would dream of this, in the United States, this amount of transparency and reliability. And in fact, when we met with the opposition, one of the members had actually worked at the National Electoral Council for 10 years. And he said, the biggest fraud is convincing people that there's fraud in Venezuela's electoral system. And what was also interesting is that they were very angry, these opposition members, and this was Action Democratica and the Christian Democrats. I can't remember the acronym, but they basically said, look, Juan Guaido would not exist without Washington, D.C. He's only really exists in Washington, D.C. He has no base here. And they were very angry because they were like, we are the opposition. He's nobody. He's nothing. We're the opposition. Nobody's paying attention to us. We want people in the United States to listen to what we're saying, to listen to our critique. And in fact, they're typical kind of conservatives. They believe in more kind of neoliberalism and private industry and things like that. But they were also opposed to the sanctions and very much, thought that they could convince the United States to stop the sanctions against Venezuela. But they very much believed in participating in the electoral process. They felt very good about it. In fact, they've been in negotiations with the Maduro government for quite a while now, as they kind of initially, I think, kind of went with Juan Guaido and then saw the corruption that he had, what he was doing that was just so ridiculous, and his losing support. And so they broke with him, and they've been negotiating with the Maduro government. And in fact, part of that negotiation prior to the election was that they agreed to choose a new body to head the National Electoral Council. So there was like a new leadership that was brought in, and they were able to get it together and do what they needed to do in time to have that election. But that's this dictator was willing to negotiate with the opposition and follow through on what it was that they were asking for. So so it's a very excellent electoral process down there in a very democratic society. And Hector mentioned the comunas. I mean, it's just from the community level on up, it's a very participatory and democratic structure. We also met with a new formation, and that's the Popular Revolutionary Alternative, which goes by the acronym APR. And this is kind of a left formation that's the Communist Party is part of it, but it's not just the political parties, it's also social movements. And they are trying to kind of push the Maduro government to they feel like, come more to the left. And they felt like this was the time to kind of take that position because the Maduro government has so much support down there, and they didn't feel a threat from the opposition. I'm not sure that all their critiques, that I agree with all their critiques, but I think that their intention is, to try to make sure that the Bolivarian process is a true, socialist process. I think that given what's happening economically in Venezuela, it's a very tough balancing act between getting the capital to do the things that you need, continuing the political process and meeting the people's needs at the same time. But that was an interesting formation. So many people have talked about the impacts of the economic war. Just to be aware that Venezuela used to be one of the top pharmaceutical producing countries in Latin America, and that pharmaceutical industry was really devastated. Hector mentioned the 2015 Obama making Venezuela a national security threat. Even before the sanctions were implemented, just that alone caused capital flight from the country. So investors pulling out of the country. But also now with the blockade over the years that has been in place, they're not able to buy the precursors they need to continue to make those medications. So this is why they have a very severe, I think, 84% shortage of medications in Venezuela. But they've also done so much to try to meet the needs of the people. You won't see homeless people in Venezuela. They've built over 3 million units of social housing. If you think about the United States, we have 10 times more population than Venezuela, and we have around 1 million units of social housing. They built 3 million and put families at low or no cost into these units. They've built schools, medical centers, hospitals. You go into the barrios that used to have really not much of anything, and now you see these beautiful schools, you see these healthcare centers everywhere. They have the CLAP program, which is a food program that gets basic supplies to families once or twice a month for just a very extremely low cost. And this serves over 6 million families in Venezuela. So if you think that's a vast majority of the population that's getting this. So they've done this despite the United States war. I want to quickly talk about the Biden administration, because we did meet, Adrian and David and I met with President Maduro and his wife and the Vice President Delcy Rodriguez and the Foreign Minister Jorge Ariaza but while we were down there, and President Maduro was kind of hopeful that the Biden administration would be willing to negotiate with them. And in fact, prior to his inauguration, Biden was saying, I think he initially was saying, I'll meet with the Maduro administration if they agree to free and fair elections. And then I think he said, no, I'll meet with them without any preconditions. And then after the inauguration, it was like, no, we're not going to meet with the Maduro administration at all. What the Maduro administration is asking for initially is to reestablish diplomatic relations, as a beginning. And I think that that's something that we should definitely be pushing for, as well as an end to the illegal sanctions on the country. But Biden went so far as to invite Carlos Vecchio, who's this fake ambassador, part of Guaido's people. And it's so ironic because Vecchio was part of this fire that was set on the treasury in Venezuela. And so when you talk about like the Capitol attack that happened here and how the Democrats are like, oh, this is so terrible, but yet they lift up this figure who basically did something fairly similar down in Venezuela and is a criminal down there. And Juan Guaido is also a criminal now. The National Assembly made it a priority to investigate Juan Guaido and came out with a report recently that charged him with all kinds of crimes of usurpation of functions, of stealing assets, corruption. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. The crimes altogether amount to over 200 years in prison. And this is who the United States, is continuing to recognize. He has no political office. He has nothing, in Venezuela at all. So I think it's really important that that we continue to push to end the sanctions. I saw the tool that Mass Peace Action has. We also have a campaign called Sanctions Kill, sanctionskill.org, and there's a petition there as well. And also we have a new toolkit that is a presentation with a script that anybody can use that educates about what sanctions are, who they impact, and then what we can do to try to stop them. And so we'll be doing a training on that on February 27th. If folks are listening, are interested in learning about that tool and how to use it. So I'll put a link in the chat for that. But I think I've talked a lot, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Margaret. That was great. We're gonna move on to questions, and we have a couple of questions in the chat. You can go ahead and jump right into that. But I wanted to, thank you guys for mentioning such key points. As far as why is the Biden administration doubling down on Guaido, and also it's incredible the amount of media warfare that's taking place against Venezuela. When you talk about how transparent the electoral system is, and then to have members of the United States administration call it fraud it just defies notion. So thank you for touching on that. I wanted to ask you a question to the three of you before we jumped into the questions that are coming in. And it's like, what do you see is next? I mean, you were down there, you saw what the Venezuelan people are facing. You met with the people on the ground, you met with members of government. I know that the Venezuelan government wants to restore diplomatic relations, but how do you see this year developing? What do you think? What is next? As far as like in the diplomatic front, and also how you see Guaido, and also the misrepresentation of what the United States is doing down there.
I could say just a couple words about that. I mean, it's the elections is a real. It produced a new path for the political process there, with the opposition parties in dialogue with the government, participating in the elections. That's something we haven't seen for the last 5 years, where the opposition was just involved in violence and calling for violent overthrow of the government, external intervention. And that's a very positive thing. There's also been a lot of inroads into, well, the importance of internationalism, connections with other countries, strengthening their ties with countries that are getting some supplies through and maintaining relations, and important ones of China, Russia, Turkey, Bolivia now. And so they're strengthening those ties. And there's also been a few cracks in this myth, this fictitious president, Guaido, like the European Union recently said they don't recognize Guaido as the president anymore. He's an important figure, but he's not the president. It would be nice that other countries followed that as well. And there was the United Nations sent one of their investigators, rapporteur, is actually, I think, still in Venezuela, making a report on the effects of the sanctions. It's good that they came and can report back. And I think it's the building ties with other countries is so important to survive. And Venezuela is making great strides in that. And I just think the political landscape on the ground has changed so much that the far right, which depends on violence, is going to just slowly fade. What the U.S. does about that, I'm not sure. But anyway, I'll just say that.
I would just add to that the level of political education in Venezuela is extremely high. Venezuelans recognize, they know what U.S. imperialism is. They recognize, the tactics that the United States is using for what they are, and they don't really get fooled by that. So there's a very strong resistance, a strong solidarity down there, and a strong awareness of what's going on. And Venezuela takes the high road, in these situations, which I think is also really important. Guaido also wrote very recently, Panama recognized the Maduro government again and doesn't recognize Guaido. So I think it's falling apart. The charade that the United States has been waging and putting Guaido up there, is totally falling apart. And I think that will continue to happen. And, the US just looks like a fool on the international stage for continuing to support this person. I think that as people who live in the United States, and it's our government that's perpetrating this on Venezuela, and all of this is illegal. What we call sanctions are really technically unilateral coercive economic measures. These are illegal under international law, and Venezuela is actually seeking they've been an investigation from the International Criminal Court of these as crimes against humanity. So we'll see how that plays out. But I think for us, we really have to raise awareness of what the United States is doing and put pressure on the Biden administration to stop this. And that's why, we created the Sanctions Kill Toolkit, because it also connects the economic war abroad to the economic war at home, and how what the US is doing abroad is also hurting us at home as well, to try to get people to understand and really, why this is important, why we should all be taking action on this. So I think we have a responsibility to continue to elevate this. That's why I think events like this, and I appreciate Mass Peace Action for organizing this, is just like, it's such a critical thing to do. We need to be talking about this wherever we are. We need to counter the lies when we see them, whether it's in our conversations or on social media or writing letters to the editor. There's lots of good sources that people can use to stay informed about what's happening in Venezuela, and Popular Resistance frequently, posts articles about this, but Venezuelan Analysis, the Orinoco Tribune, Telesur, the Gray Zone, all of these are really great sources for keeping up with what's going on down there. And I think that having a functioning parliament, a functioning National Assembly, because the previous one, Adrian talked about a little bit, was in contempt of court of the Supreme Court in Venezuela, and so for the 5 years really wasn't functioning. Now they're very excited to have an actual functioning National Assembly, and I think they'll be able to, they have, like 100 or 200 day plan, I can't remember, to try to help to turn around the economy in Venezuela. So I think that's going to be huge for the people down there as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. We have a couple of questions that came in. I'm gonna go ahead and read the first one. We have Okay, a question here. States that Human Rights Watch portrays a very different view of what is going on in Venezuela. I take it that you collectively will reject a report of Human Rights Watch.
Do you want to talk about that, Adrian, or should I?
I'll just say the quick version, which is that Human Rights Watch has consistently sided with the State Department on everything. I mean, Human Rights Watch is basically concerned about human rights in countries that the United States doesn't like. And so Human Rights Watch has been virtually silent on Honduras, where I work, which is my primary site, where there are actual everyday enormous violations of human rights. And yet they invent violations of human rights to support the US agenda abroad in every country where, where it serves the US State Department's interests. But I think Margaret can speak more specifically to it. I mean, they have, and there's a real revolving door problem with Human Rights Watch as well, where you've got people who are directly working for the United States government, then going into Human Rights Watch in high-level positions, and then going back to work for the US government. It's completely interlocked, as are so many of the think tanks in Washington with agencies of the state. And that was when I was mentioning earlier that there was this drumbeat leading up to the 2015 elections about how the elections were going to be fraudulent. And like every single, from the Heritage Foundation, which is sort of far right, to the monologue, we call it the Inter-American Dialogue, which posits itself as being, sort of centrist, but actually is also far right, to like the universities, like my university, were just completely parroting this line from the State Department to promote its policy abroad. Human Rights Watch very much falls within that camp, where the vast majority of its positions, especially with regards to Latin America, with Vivanco as the director, have been completely aligned with US priorities. And so they actually serve as a propaganda arm for the US government in that regard. They have, they're interesting because with regard to Palestine, they've done some interesting things, and it's but with Latin America, they're atrocious. That's all I have to say. But Margaret, were you going to say something?
I just say I agree with you, but Venezuela actually has a Ministry of Human Rights. We met with the head of that, Larry DeVoe, when I was there in 2019, and they actually when things happen, they take it seriously. So when, I think there was a situation where a member of the military fired on someone and either injured or killed that person, and they felt like it was a measure that had gone too far, they actually investigated what happened and held that person accountable. I mean, they've done this on many levels. If the police or members of the military use excessive force, in situations, they actually investigate that and try to hold that person accountable and prevent it, unlike in the United States, where there's almost complete impunity of our law enforcement to do whatever they want against people. So yeah, I agree. Human Rights Watch is not a reliable source, particularly on Latin America. And yeah, so don't believe what you read.
For sure. Even mentioning right next door in Colombia, the atrocities that happen in Colombia that are not reported in the same way. Thank you for that.
Is that who she is?
We have another question. Could someone comment on the extent of corruption in Venezuela, especially in the Guaido camp and the military?
I'm not familiar with the corruption in the military. I think in the Guaido camp, Guaido was given all kinds of money from the United States, from this international humanitarian aid, and they found that they don't really know where the money went in many cases, or it was spent on things that it wasn't supposed to be spent on. So maybe everybody could mute, that would be great.
Venezuela.
But anyway, yeah, so the Guaido, they just did this investigation and found all kinds of corruption there. But I think what's interesting about Venezuela, we have to remember that the oligarchs were in power for a long time, and there used to be in tremendous poverty in Venezuela prior to the Bolivarian Revolution. And now that poverty, they were taking great steps initially to mitigate it, but the blockade has made that difficult. But still, it's better than I think it was. Those oligarchs are still they're still there. They're still in positions of government, and so I think Venezuela is trying to take steps to deal with any kind of corruption that is down there. But they didn't, it's a democratic society. They didn't just come in and say, okay, all our oligarchs are out. It's a real delicate line that they have to balance down there.
And I think the same is true for the national police. There are instances of corruption, and this was true also for the nationalized oil industry, right? And so there were lots of bolichicos, ¿verdad? There has been corruption, and it's certainly something that the government, the Maduro and administration have been fighting against, but it pales in comparison to Guaido. I mean, there's indisputable evidence of him working with major drug traffickers in Colombia, and collaborating with them with just stealing millions of dollars that the United States has stolen from the legitimate Venezuelan government and handed over to Guaido. And of course, no repercussions from the United States, despite the fact that he's defrauding the United States as well as the Venezuelan people with his actions. And the corruption narrative, what I have found in Latin America generally is it's a sort of Janus face, a complicated narrative. I find that it's used in Honduras, for example. They talk about corruption instead of talking about really the root causes of violence, which have to do with U.S. intervention. If we're talking about the coup in Honduras, for example. So they talk about corruption when really the problem is imperialism. I'll just leave it there.
Great. Thank you. We have
Hello?
another question. Hello? I guess not everyone is muted. Is it possible to perhaps mute everyone? Let's see.
Hello.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is a good question here. Can you say more about the tensions between the Maduro government reaching out to the private sector and the popular sector to move further to the left?
I don't know the specifics, but I know that the Venezuelan government has really struggled to get the capital it needs because so much of its wealth has been stolen by the United States. The United States took Citgo and all, I think, billions of dollars that are part of Citgo. The Bank of England is holding over $1 billion of Venezuela's gold and refusing to give it to Venezuela. They wanted to actually use it to buy medicine and food through the United Nations programs. And the US and its ally, the UK, are blocking that. So there's been a real struggle to get capital to build the infrastructure, keep the industries running in Venezuela. And so I think there has been discussions, with private sector to try to provide some of that. And of course, the Bolivarian process is very much about creating a socialist economy. And so that was kind of the area where when I talked to the Popular Revolutionary Alternative people, I didn't feel like they had a real grasp of the complexity and the difficulties that you face in trying to balance meeting your population's needs and trying to push forward the eco-socialist project. But there have been a lot of investment in Venezuela in kind of cooperatives and public infrastructure and things like that. So Yeah, so I think I don't know all the details, but that's kind of the basic gist of it.
I'll just say one comment to that. I mean, I think it's important, and we were told that, reiterated a number of times, that socialism is not a thing you can just decree from the government or a law. It's a process, and it's a process that's complex, as Margaret mentioned. And in some point, especially when you're under siege, and they're making strategic alliances for survival of the economy. And meeting the needs, it's what Chavez did when first came to power. You had all this oil wealth, you had incredible poverty and needs of the people, and he chose to meet those needs using that wealth. And there are other strategic decisions and alliances that they're making. And I think in general, most of the people trust them in the decisions they're making. And in the process of discussions with these other Chavista left parties who have strong criticisms, those dialogues are important to have. And dialogue is the real key. That's what the Maduro government is having with both sides. And so it's a process, and that's all.
I should quickly add that with the opposition, the left kind of opposition folks said, we agree with the Maduro government on the majority of what they're doing. We just wanted to have some space to be able to critique the things that we think should be criticized. But they mostly and have been supportive of the Maduro government, and were silent about their criticism until now. They feel like the Maduro government is in a stronger place, and they are, feel more space to be able to make that criticism without undermining the Bolivarian process.
For sure, it's discussed enough.
Two things work. Corrupt out of weak
Breaking up.
problem. And thirdly, here in Rhode Island, I'm very interested in developing some ties. And my history with Venezuela, 2007 in April, I brought the ambassador then, the late Bernardo Alvarez Herrera, and he spoke at Brown University and also to the Latino groups in Providence. I hope we can build going up in Boston, and if we can get the uncorrupted video, half of it was somehow, maybe my machine, maybe it's yours, I don't know. So please, I beg you, let's keep in touch. We're ready to try to collaborate down here, but also we need the contacts and we need some of the data. But really, I'm so glad to be in touch now. So that's my plea.
Thank you for that comment. You are a little broken up there.
You want to speak to that, Yoav, or someone from the Latin America Working Group? Someone from Mass?
We will send a follow-up to this webinar with a link to the recording, the YouTube recording of the webinar, and how to get in touch with us. So everybody is certainly welcome to join the MAPA Latin America Working Group, which sponsored this webinar. And if you are in Western Massachusetts, you are certainly invited to join the Latin America Solidarity Coalition of Western Mass, and we will send you a link to both organizations in a day or two.
So the Reverend that spoke is from Rhode Island, and he wants to collaborate with Massachusetts activists. I think that's what he was mainly saying.
Okay, wonderful, great, thank you. I think we have time for a couple of more questions. Wonder if you guys could talk about, if this came up in your travels to Venezuela, about how important it is, the Iranian Venezuelan cooperation. If you can say something about that, how that's going.
I mean, I'll start. I think David touched on that, but there's been, tremendous cooperation between a number of countries with Venezuela, and Iran is certainly one. Iran, I think it was it early last year that they sent 5 tankers of oil and equipment to Venezuela. The United States actually has the largest military presence, naval presence around Venezuela that it's had in 30 years down there. And what's interesting is that Iran and Venezuela were willing to defy the United States, to directly challenge the United States blockade. And Iran sent these 5 tankers, and the Venezuelan military came out to the edge of its water zone and met those tankers and escorted them in to Venezuela. And those tankers got in. And this was really critical, one, to show the solidarity and defiance of the US, but 2, Venezuela's oil industry has been really hurt by it, been crippled, by this economic blockade, because Venezuelan oil is very thick. They're number 1 in the world in oil reserves, but it's very thick, and they need materials to dilute it in order to be able to refine it, as well as they needed parts to be able to keep their refineries functioning and to get other ones online. And so Iran has brought that, and now I think they also have another set of tankers on the way. And there was a set in between that the US intercepted and stole the oil and sold the oil. Real piracy. But Iran and Venezuela have also cooperated on a new supermarket that carries Iranian products that's just opened in Venezuela. I think Gray Zone has a good report on that. But Russia has been providing intelligence support, vaccines. China's been sending supplies over. So this willingness to just defy the United States, I think, is really important. And also, there's been a lot of work that countries have done through the United Nations to kind of start to build this international solidarity against the United States' illegal sanctions. I mean, it's why are countries, we know why, because the US unfortunately still has, power, but countries are respecting these illegal acts of the United States, which are having a tremendous toll on the well-being and the lives of people around the world. There are sanctions on 39 countries, a third of the world's population. And I think at some point, as we see these other countries become bolder, more of them, I hope, will be defying this and pursuing legal action, to hold the US accountable.
Thank you, Margaret.
Actually,
Who's speaking right now?
my question.
Yeah, you're broken up, unfortunately. We cannot hear you.
It's Reverend Keller again trying to speak, but his sound is not working very well.
Okay.
Perhaps you could type into the chat.
Stop in the question, yeah.
Yeah. If I could just add again to what Margaret said, I mean, I think she said everything that really matters here in terms of the Iran-Venezuela collaboration, and just how tremendously important this international refutation of US empire is, and in particular the sanctions kill campaign that Margaret has really taken a lead role on. But also, again, to reemphasize how important it is now that we have a democratic administration in the United States to not let our guard down and to actually ramp up our anti-imperialist advocacy, because I think these are when the people who might protest imperialism from in the United States tend to get soft. I mean, we tend to sort of forget about this during during democratic administrations, and this is when it's most dangerous. And there's recognition around the world of the outrageous violations of international law that the US is engaged in with its sanctions, its unilateral coercive measures, which are collective punishment, which are illegal, and which are, tremendous human rights violations. And this is when we really need to be ramping up rather than sort of relaxing and being grateful that Trump's gone. I think it's more dangerous now than it was a few months ago, for Venezuela and all of the countries that are suffering under the United States, frankly, genocidal violence of unilateral coercive measures.
Yeah, very well said. That's for sure. It's good to point out that both political parties in the United States, the Republicans and Democrats, both serve empire very well. It's a bipartisan issue. They both support it. And we're seeing this clearly with Biden supporting Guaido, holding on to something that just has no merit in the international sphere. Wanted to, somebody asked about Elliot Abrams, and I wanted to know if he's still in the picture behind the scenes, or if he was fired.
Thankfully, I believe he is no longer the U.S. envoy to Venezuela. However, Elliot Abrams is a genocidaire, and we should not lose sight of that. He is also, ironically or not, on the board of directors of the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And I think there's there's just so many levels of violence and irony there in terms of the conflation of the Zionist project with the violations of human rights around the world. Elliot Abrams, of course, we know from his history in Central America, whether we're talking about his support of the Rios Montt regime and genocide in Guatemala, or his denial and active support of the El Mozote massacre in El Salvador, or his role in the Iran-Contra affair, has been a central player in the mass murder of Central Americans. And, of course, he's then launched his career on that basis and, became the envoy to Venezuela under Trump, promoting the same kind of policies, of neoconservative policies that he has really backed his entire career, that are, fully in line with his ultra right-wing Zionist project. And so he's a tremendously dangerous figure. But yet again, the fact that he is not, as far as I understand, he is no longer the special envoy to Venezuela, does not mean that the fundamentals of the policy have changed at all. Here we have this evil ogre genocidaire figure that was easy to sort of peg on to him, just as we sort of, focus on Trump and how evil Trump is, but the policies that they represent continue. And that's the real danger, again, of a democratic, not democratic, but a Democrat, big D, administration being in power, because actually Biden has the same, the same priorities that Trump did with vis-a-vis Venezuela, as well as Israel, for that matter.
For sure, for sure. Thank you. I wanted to ask you guys, looking at the questions, and I think we've done pretty good. I wanted to take the time to ask you guys if you wanted to wrap up some final statements. I personally want to thank you, Margaret, David, and Adrian, for standing up for Venezuela continually. Really appreciate it. The work that you're doing matters. I know that we're fighting against a machine, a PR machine that it's really hard to find the truth. So we have to continue to speak the truth, and you guys are doing that on behalf of the Venezuelan people. And I appreciate that. So thank you for doing that. So I wanted to ask you if you wanted to chime in with some closing remarks.
David, do you want to start?
Yes, I'm sorry. I think it's really important what Adrian said, that to watch the Biden administration, the people he's surrounding himself with, are basically been supportive of the same kind of interventionist policies. And we've got to really be on them and be on the media to report that. And I think it's so important to, as Margaret emphasized strongly, how illegal the sanctions are. And so many people think sanctions are just some kind of little rule or some little fine you get for doing some little thing wrong. It's war and it's killing people. But I think in terms of so many people, progressives and on the left here, scrutinize in such detail the political, what's going on in the political process in Venezuela. And, is it socialist enough? Is it too authoritarian? And I think that the main thing that we ought to emphasize for people here of all political ilks is you should be against intervention and you should be against the sanctions because it's illegal, but more important, it's killing people. And what I try to frame to people instead of in some circles, instead of just looking at the geopolitical balance and various kinds of analysis, is just ask people here, how would you feel if another country, whether it's France or Costa Rica or whatever, didn't like our government here and thought we were, there was corruption and they didn't like how things were going in our elections. And so we decided to blockade our ports, prevent medicines coming in for our families and our children, prevent food coming in, and block all the things we're doing. If people really looked at it, when I talk to about that, they say, of course not. We wouldn't allow that. But that's what we're doing to Venezuela. And we just have to put it into, real terms, put ourselves in their shoes and not try to scrutinize, how they run their country and decisions they're making. These last elections they had were a real example of the Venezuela people speaking like, and one of the best signs I saw on the street, it was just a sign that said, Yankee respeta, meaning you Yankees, United States, you need to respect us. And I think that's what the elections were an example of, and what the spirit of the Venezuelan people defending their dignity is, and that gives them the strength to continue what they're doing. So that's all I wanted to share.
Thank you, David.
I'll be really brief. I just want to say thank you so much for hosting this. Thank you, Hector. Thank you, Joab. It's so important for us to be having this conversation because I think it's really, it's a conversation that's hard to have in the United States. Venezuela is just such a taboo topic, among anybody but people who sort of understand the violence of neoliberal capitalism and imperialism, which I think is a small segment of us. So thank you, and I really want to remind everybody to look at that Sanctions Kill campaign, because I think that's where we really need to be going. And with that, I'll turn it over to Margaret because she's the one who really knows all about that.
Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, and thank you so much for organizing this. As Adrian and David said, this is so critical that we educate ourselves in the United States. We're living in an interesting period because analysts have been saying for a while, and it's playing out, that the United States empire is failing. We are living in a failed state that cannot even meet the basic needs of its population or protect the health of its population. And so, but the United States foreign policy is what you kind of see in these phases. It's just the Pentagon recognizes that the U.S. is losing primacy and is actually recommending greater military spending, greater surveillance, greater aggression, and this hurts us as living in this empire economy. So this is a really tricky time where it's critical that we have this analysis of what's going on and presenting a vision of what we need in order to meet the needs of the people and create a society that's functioning and not being a destructive force at home and abroad. The economic war that's being waged against Venezuela and other countries by the United States is the same economic war that we're experiencing here. And we've been, when we were in Venezuela, we met with some of the social movements down there. We've been in dialogue with them. They really emphasized that we need a bi-directional solidarity, because they've been resisting this US imperialism for such a long time that they've really learned a lot about resisting it. And so we have a lot to learn from them, as well as them sharing ways that they've been meeting their basic needs. We can talk to them about what the reality is here, in the United States. And so we've been doing some webinars that are bilingual, English and Spanish, and we're going to continue to do those. So if you check out Popular Resistance's YouTube channel, you'll find, the ones that we've done so far, and we'll have, some coming up. So I think that that's, really important that we build these international relationships and solidarity and learn from each other and, struggle together. And then, Adrian mentioned the Sanctions Kill. Please go to sanctionskill.org. Check out the new toolkit. It's just sanctionskill.org/toolkit. Check out the petition there. And we'll be doing a training on February 27th. So you'll find that information as well. And then also just, as a peace movement, as an anti-war, anti-imperialist movement, it's imperative that we strengthen ourselves under the Biden administration, because like Obama, Biden will be the more effective evil at waging these wars and these interventions. And so we can't do what happened under Obama, where the peace movement was really decimated. We have to, this is a critical time for us to strengthen, to make these demands for what we need, and to be effective in our actions. So thank you to everyone that participated tonight, and I look forward to struggling with you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you again for being here tonight. Wonderful presentations, great conversations, and looking forward to more working together for sure. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hector.
Everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Bye,
Nice to
everybody.
be with
Good night,
you.
thank you.